Elon Musk, future emperor of Mars, has gained many admirers for his idiosyncratic, freewheeling style of communication, his indifference to the administrative norms of stagnant liberal control states, and his surprising ability to push entrenched capitalism toward a more futuristic and more fun-seeming style of industrial production. But he also strikes many people as a particularly reckless example of the neo-medieval techno-oligarchy that seems to be taking over this planet without a lot of concern for the security, sensitive circumstances, and multidimensional thriving of vulnerable human beings here and now. So Musk's financial acquisition of the stupidly popular Twitter microblogging app has understandably led to both enthusiastic and terrified hysteria among news followers around the world. Is he about to tip our already degraded information ecology over into a demon-infested sewer ditch of Trumpists, QAnons, anti-vaxxers, Putin pushers, and transphobes? Or is this the beginning of a bold new age of free speech protected from reactionary moral panics and the insidious, suppressive, often anti-science propaganda decisions cooked up between government administrations and the shadowy denizens of the corporate backrooms? Well, it's probably not going to be either of those things. But on the off chance that Elon is serious about improving both the quality and freedom of the discourse in the digital public square, Jim Rutt wrote a recent Quillette article proposing some basic principles for a more intelligent, more lively, and more ethical style of moderation. Now, longtime fans of this podcast will know that I consider Jim Rutt to be a dangerous subversive, a neo-fascist hate-monger and direct threat to our fragile democracy, whose wantonly offensive and deeply inhumane ideas should be stricken from the public record to prevent them from contaminating easily reprogrammable passive human minds. Here to spew his toxic venom is notorious enemy of goodness but friend of the show, the always buoyant free speech relativist, Jim Rutt. Hi, Jim.
Hey, Layman. Good to be back, you motherfucker.
Jim, what agitated you enough to write this article?
It was actually, if I took a sane version of your introduction, I'd say it was the fact that I saw Elon's move as poised on the cusp between goodness and disaster. And having been a domain that I personally have been involved with for 41 years, I said, when the world is poised on the knife's edge between great good and great bad, and I probably have literally more real world experience, at least in time, than any other person on earth, it would seem to me grossly irresponsible not to put my oar in the water and give it a stir. So that's why I did it.
Nice. Now, it seems to me that what we collectively want to do, kind of obviously, is maximize the likelihood that we're going to get a virtuous convergence of free expression, security, the non-spread of virulent thought forms, and a thriving discourse in which more coherent ideas are upregulated, but hidden biases are constantly challenged by the anti-fragilating ferment of contradictory viewpoints. So to aim at that sweet spot, we need to get outside of a simplistic conversation of moderation versus no moderation and start asking which kinds of moderation and in which particular forms can be feasibly and simultaneously implemented to increase our chances of moving discourse toward a kind of omni-win condition. So your proposal involves making adjudications for decorum, content, and viewpoint. Maybe you would walk us through those categories. What are they, and what's the essence of your approach to each of them?
All right. Sounds good. Yes. And you hit on it. The other thing that caused me to write this article was sort of reaction at the stupidity and naivete of the free speech absolutists on one side. And Elon Musk is going to, take the whole thing to the shitter on the other, right? And that there's much nuanced ground in between. And, anyone who's worked on solving real world problems, particularly social problems, and particularly network social problems, realize that good answers are always in the gray. They're always nuanced, right? A or B is generally not where you end up. So I said, let me think about this a little bit using my literally 41 years of experience. And so I concluded that a lens, it's called a lens because it's not an answer, but it's a way of thinking that I think will lead people towards answers, is to divide moderation up into three kinds, which have three different attributes and three different impacts. The first distinction I wanted to make was between content and what I called point of view moderation. And let's start with content, and let's start with a subset of content, which is inherently and immediately dangerous content. Canonical examples: how to make a bomb, or how a teenage girl can hide from her mother that she's getting ready to commit suicide. Things like that. Those are limited, contained, and have historically been things that
things that are directly physically dangerous. That kind of content is already taken out.
Yeah, though interestingly, the absolutists disagree with that. And then I get lots of comments on some of these Facebook, my essay posts, and I've been on various podcasts, etc. So inherently dangerous content, but I think any reasonable person would realize that somewhere along the continuum, there's some content that's just so immediately dangerous that it should not go on. Direct threats of violence against other people. Doxing is another classic example of inherently dangerous content that should be enumerated and should do so clearly. But then the other perspective, and this is where I fucked up. My brain fart didn't give me the correct three forks on my article. So that's between decorum and content, not point of view. We'll talk about that later. So let's rewind slightly. Okay, I'm back on track now. So hey, all you young people, it sucks getting old, goddamn it, motherfucker. Right? You forget shit. So we'll start with the fork between content and decorum, and we just talked about inherently dangerous content. And different people will differ on where they want to draw that line, and one would expect Elon to probably be relatively liberal, but probably not insane. And that was probably not all that controversial. But the second one, I think, is where the most useful help comes, and that's to add a class called decorum, which is how we deal with each other. For instance, personal attacks is an example of decorum. I go, Layman Pascal, you suck dick, right? That either is or is not allowed by a rule of decorum on an online site. And it's important to note that decorum rules do and should vary. The decorum rules appropriate for Twitter might be quite different than from a Disney site, for instance, or a professional scientific discussion forum like the kind that are moderated by the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences. And so choosing the decorum rules for your online site is absolutely indispensable to defining what your site is about. And the idea that you could have no decorum rules, and I will say, Elon, it scared me a little bit since I published my essay, in that he seemed to indicate that is it legal could be the standard. He did say for censorship, whatever censorship means. Of course, in the legal sense, a platform is not engaged in censorship, since at least in free countries, platform companies can be more restrictive than government. The First Amendment in the United States in particular is very extreme. I mean, you can say almost anything and it's legal in the United States. Not so true with you goddamn Canucks, but in the US, where these platforms are headed, you could, for instance, literally say in an argument about sports teams, screw you, you N-word, and actually insert the actual N-word. That is legal in the United States, not so in other countries, but it could be legal. Another example that I give that shows how bad it could be if you use "is it legal" as a standard is some stupid argument about political candidates. I hope your house burns down and you and your family die, right? That's actually legal in the United States, but extraordinarily disruptive of good faith discussion, interpersonal relationships, etc. So I certainly hope that Elon is merely naive when he talks about legal as the standard for censorship, or he means something different by censorship, because any system that doesn't have decorum, I can tell you from many years of experience, is going to turn into a shit show, and fast. And all the good people who are capable of having a quality conversation and bringing good ideas to the table, are going to go elsewhere. No one, I'm not going to put up with having to constantly experience the kind of examples I gave there. And in fact, I would argue for the opposite, that the decorum rules should be very extensively strengthened on Twitter. And it would be, a whole series of things that thou shalt not do. Interestingly, on our home website, game-b.org, we have a fairly extensive set of rules, 10 commandments, essentially, that enforce relatively strong decorum rules, much stronger than on Twitter. And the emergent result is the quality of the conversations are much better. And I think that's the important takeaway. And I hope Elon listens to this, or one of my other podcast appearances, and realizes that if you have, the stronger you make your decorum rules, the safer it is to go wide on the last category, which is viewpoint, point of view. And this is almost like a two-dimensional slider. To the degree that you have no decorum rules, you can't talk about baseball teams without people beating each other over the head and inflaming things. If you have rather rigid decorum rules, you can talk about absolutely anything and do it in a respectful manner, which does not inflame the conversation and allows the ideas themselves to compete in the marketplace of ideas. And that, I hope, and from what I've read and from people who know him, they concur that what Elon really cares about is the third basket. So we have inherently dangerous content, we have decorum, and then the third basket is point of view. Think about that as the payload of what you're actually trying to say, right? So I'm trying to say the Toronto Blue Jays, I hate them, right? That's my payload, right? Point of view, the worker should own the means of production. That's your point of view, and what I hope Elon is intending is to produce an environment where we back away from what the platforms have been doing with respect to restricting point of view. The example I used in the essay was the systematic and broad attack on QAnon by the platforms, by Twitter, by Facebook, by YouTube, and by the others. And let me make it very clear, as I do in the essay, I think QAnon is a bunch of goofy ass ideas that has almost no chance of being true, and is at least to some degree harmful. But as I also point out, there are lots of other ideas that fit into the category of things that Jim Rutt thinks are stupid and bad. And those include Christianity, astrology, and Marxist-Leninism. And I would say probably at least two out of those three are worse in some ways than QAnon floating around loose in the meme space. But it's not my job, nor should it be anybody's job, to put their preferences about what ideas have merit into action via censoring them. So it would be my hope and vision that if Elon is actually going to be a force for the good, he's going to be able to turn back the dial on viewpoint moderation and make it much more point of view moderation, make it much more open, while at the same time strengthening decorum so that we can actually discuss ideas that are way outside the norm in a way that is constructive and doesn't degenerate into name calling, cursing, racial slurs, etc. Now, why is this important? And this is something I've actually learned more about through these conversations, and it's the fact that important new ideas always come from the fringe, but at the same time, most ideas on the fringe are bad. A very nice analogy that the host of one of the podcasts, I think it was the Quillet podcast, actually refined my own idea. He called it the garage band effect, that most garage bands suck, right? I've been to lots of parties in my misspent youth with garage bands. Most of them were terrible. However, if we didn't have garage bands, rock and roll would never progress at all, right? And I used the green shoots analogy that there's lots and lots of things that grow up at the edge of the woods, right? Most of them are weeds, but every once in a while there's a new and interesting tree that adds to the forest, right? And then I think the most powerful analogy is biology. If you talk to an evolutionary theorist, they'll tell you that 99% plus, more like 99.9% of mutations are bad for the offspring organism where the mutation occurred. But if it hadn't been for mutations, you and I'd still be bacteria. How about that, right? So you've got to tolerate the garage band, the green shoots, and the mutations in biology if you're ever going to move ahead. And this is the thing that I find most disturbing with the current state of play of the platforms is they are pretty aggressive at stomping on anything that's against the status quo because they don't understand it. They think it's bad. Even us do-gooder bleeding hearts over on the Game B world got stomped on by Facebook. We talked about that on your show. And I think it was accidental, probably due to the idiocy of their algorithms. But it's an example of how even good green shoots, ones that we think are going to save the world, of course, we're probably wrong, but hey, that's life, got stomped by the platform. How many other ideas have been stomped by these platforms because they were heterodox, because they were on the fringe? So if we're going to have progress, we have to tolerate the fringe. And that's why this is so important.
So just about everybody agrees, at least in our part of the world, that criminal, physically dangerous content should be blocked. There's a lot of disagreement around viewpoint, with some people favoring very broad access to viewpoints and other people thinking that some viewpoints are inherently malware that contaminate the population. And your feeling is that a lot of that concern around viewpoint can actually be handled over on the decorum front. Now, decorum is a very interesting thing when you try to separate it from content. I play around with this a lot. It's fun to tell a dog it's awful in a nice voice or yell at it that it's a good dog, right? In my opening spiel there, I presented some content that was clearly not my viewpoint, and that was signaled by the style in which I was doing it. So I guess I'm curious how you come at the question of creating decorum rules. Like for you, when you look at content that you find objectionable, how do you decide that it's nice enough to tolerate? What are the principles of the netiquette that would go into making decorum rules?
Yeah, and I think it's very important to acknowledge there is no bright line, right? I can't look up in a guidebook and say, this is good decorum, that's bad decorum, right? And as I said, it will vary by different systems and even by subsets of systems. For instance, Facebook has their system-wide decorum rules for the general Facebook, but each group in Facebook can add its own decorum rules, and they usually do. So I think that they have to be developed carefully. Right. And as I say later in the piece, one of the other problems, particularly with Facebook, to a lesser degree, Twitter, I think Twitter's case is it doesn't have enough specificity, is we should think about these as similar to the criminal statute book. Right. It should be quite granular, and that each piece should be no longer than 100 words of English, and it should be in plain English that's understandable to a IQ 100 15-year-old. And it should be quite specific. And of course, inevitably, there'll be exceptions that we realize are objectionable and anti-decorous, but aren't yet covered by the statutes, in which case, do the same thing as the state does, have a new statute. So the statute book is growing and changing and editing, but it's always live, and presumably it should be on a wiki-like device, so you can also see the evolution of each component and make sure that you haven't been charged with an ex post facto rule, which is you shouldn't be ever charged with violating a decorum rule which did not exist at the time. And some of them could be very precise. The famous George Carlin, 7 dirty words you're not allowed to say on the TV, right? You might have that. I don't know how I'd operate if I couldn't say fuck online, but, I'm sure I'd figure it out. I like to point out that the Beatles and all the revolutionary work they did around social and psychotechnological change never said fuck in any of their songs, right? They managed to do an incredible body of work that changed the world way more than any of my work will ever do, and managed to keep it PG-13, which is the U.S. standard for movies suitable for young teenagers. And so, even a seven dirty words decorum ban might cramp my style a little bit, but actually would not stop the exploration of essentially all of idea space. A little bit more problematic. What does it actually mean is the no personal attacks rule. on The Well, which is an online community. It's probably the oldest surviving online community. It started in 1985 as a spinoff of the Whole Earth Review. That whole San Francisco Bay Area crowd still exists, well.com. In the interest of full disclosure, I am a small minority owner of The Well when the users bought it from their previous owner. There's two current events and politics conferences, one called Currents and the other called Politics. One explicitly allows personal attacks, hilariously, explicitly allows it right in the rules. And the other one specifically disallows personal attacks. And there's essentially been an evolving jurisprudence about what disallowing personal attacks means. And one version of the jurisprudence is I can't call you a racist for something that you wrote. Layman, you're a racist because you wrote X. However, you can say, Layman, what you wrote is racist. And that's kind of a subtle distinction. And one could actually enumerate examples like that in the statute book, right? If 12.3 is a ban on personal attacks, 12.3.1 is an example of what is a personal attack. 12.3.2 is an example of what is not a personal attack, and then gradually built up the jurisprudence in a written form that people can look to and rely upon. And so I think that is how you proceed. And inevitably, there will be close calls, boundary cases, unclarity, et cetera. So one needs a appeals process. And I laid out some ideas on appeals processes. I'd be happy to go into that, but I'll put it back to you.
Yeah, I'll cycle back around to the appeals process in a little bit. I'm curious where you think of spam as fitting into all of this. Does that fall under decorum, or is that a category of its own?
I put spam under bad content.
Bad content.
And, that's a categorical bad stuff that essentially is pure pollution of the meme space. And for instance, in our game -B, we have a very specific, one of the 10 points is spam. And we just kill it on site. Anybody that's a repeated spammer, we kill them too. So I think but again, you have to define what is spam and with some care. But no, I would put spam in the content bucket of inherently deleterious content.
One of the things that leaps out at me on these issues is, in the general discussion, the assumption is usually that there has to be a central homogeneous way to impose these rules, rather than thinking that the individual user can be the curator. Right? When I'm using my Google search, I can decide to put safe search on or not, and parents can set content controls for children. So to what degree do you think these decisions could be made by giving the control to the individuals rather than making general platform decisions?
I do allude to this in passing in the essay, and in the next essay I'm going to write where I expand on some issues. I'm going to hit this more, which is in the future, these kinds of self-moderation tools would be an important part of the ecosystem, but they don't exist today. So my suggestions are in the context of the fact that our current moderation tools are very limited. Basically, all we can do is block somebody is about it. But for instance, wouldn't it be great to say, I'm happy to hear Layman Pascal, as long as he doesn't use the word integral. If so, I don't want to hear it, right? As an example. And that ties in closely to another part of what Elon has proposed, but in a somewhat naive way, which is he proposed open sourcing the feed algorithm in Twitter, because people may or may not know, you don't just see what all your the people you follow have posted in chronological order. There's a fairly massive reshuffling of what you see when based on a whole bunch of algorithms, which we don't know. And Elon suggested open sourcing that algorithm, which I think could be good. On the other hand, it could easily make it more easy to game it. And so I'm a little concerned about that. So I've counter-proposed in the essay a more radical idea, which is to allow plug-compatible feed algorithms, and that there be a marketplace for feed algorithms, and that they all have to be open source, which would then produce a diverse ecosystem of feed algorithms, which would be much harder to source. to game. And by the way, those feed algorithms could also include automated decorum rules, right? If I don't want to ever see the word fuck, I don't ever want to see Toronto Blue Jays, I subscribe to a feed algorithm that allows me to customize it in some specific ways. And then of course I can get even smarter, anything layman liked, definitely don't show me that, right? And one could imagine feed algorithms that essentially amount to a personalized decorum tool, at least in part. So I do think that the suggestions about platform wide criminal statute style decorum rules are in the current state of very rudimentary user tools. And as the user tools get better, we may be able to back off of those things considerably.
One of the things that's interesting here is this notion of scale in terms of whether something's public or private. So when you set up your own small little community, then policing the decorum can sometimes police the viewpoints. You go, this is a group where we don't want to hear any perspectives of X, Y, or Z kind. But then you get to some kind of public level, and you think, well, maybe Twitter's the digital town square, and therefore we should be really open to viewpoints in that space. Do you think we should be open at all the scales, or do you think there's some sort of threshold you cross at which something is considered to be public? And if so, what is that threshold?
Very good question. And it's something I did not address in the essay because I was talking about Twitter. And Twitter does not have subspaces. I would suggest it probably should. But think about Reddit, which is all subspaces. There is no public Reddit, right? All of Reddit is so-called subreddits, which have their own moderators, their own rules. Now, there's an overarching Reddit set of rules you can't violate, but some of the Reddit rules are quite funny. The Harley Davidson group, do not talk about Japanese motorcycles, right? Et cetera. And that's fine. I call that domain rules. That's a different thing. Our Game B group, for instance, both our private one and the one on Facebook, we say, while constructive criticism is indispensable, outright opposition to Game B will not be tolerated in this venue. On the other hand, in open Facebook or open Twitter, outright objection and enmity to Game B ought to be tolerated. So I think there's a big distinction between the public square, and Twitter is all public square. There are no domains in it other than that which sort of self-assembles, while Reddit is all domain, and Facebook is an interesting hybrid where there's part public and part groups, as they call. And so I think that when you go to groups, which are membranes, and in our Game B theory, we talk about membranes and protocols, and what passes through the semi-permeable membrane is actually quite important. So I think it's entirely legitimate for membranes, for groups, to say this is off out of bounds, even with respect to point of view. But that's not appropriate in the public square. The purpose of the public square is to sort and sift all ideas and have the ones that are good gradually gain support, and those that are bad gradually lose support. At least that's the hypothesis.
The notion of green shoots and garage bands intrigues me, right? That there are good mutations. They are few, but the space must be protected in which those few can arise. Very sensible idea, very difficult to implement for a couple of reasons, I think. One is that human beings find it very difficult to distinguish between what's dangerous and what reminds them of dangerous things. And systems of control are interested in increasing their control, even if it puts complex evolution of the commons in jeopardy. So what are the odds that the kind of changes you're proposing will gain any hold when it's up against two such powerful entrenched forces?
Yes. Let me talk about the second one first. Then I'm going to ask you a couple questions about the second one. I'm not sure I entirely understood it. Obviously, power loves to be powerful, right? And that's what's going on right now. These peculiar oligarchs who control the public squares that we have at Twitter and Facebook, principally, but also Instagram to a lesser degree, and actually YouTube to a significant degree, have power, and they love to use it, and they're using it. And I think that is problematic. And I think the right answer in a democracy would be to have statutes that basically implement some of these ideas. And I would not implement them for, again, the garage band idea. I would not implement them against the smaller platforms, but anybody who has, like, say, 25 million unique visitors per month, let's say in the United States, would be subject to something like the ideas that I have laid out, that you can and we are encouraged to have as rigid a decorum rules as you want, or relatively loose ones if that's what you think is right for your community, to have specified dangerous content rules, but otherwise don't discriminate with respect to a point of view. Now, and so power wants to be powerful. Power will always be abused, and it is. And that's why in a democracy, you constrain power by the law. I would say this case of Elon Musk and Twitter is a unique situation where we have the world's richest guy, who also happens to be a bit of a hardcore crank about free speech. And so I think we're getting a early look at what these ideas might look like way earlier than we'd ever get through the legislative political process, which, as you know, takes years, decades. How long did the civil rights movement percolate? At least 50 years, right? And, every great change of this sort takes a long time. But this is an opportunistic and found case where world's richest guy gets a burr up his ass to try out free speech at scale. And so I think we should take advantage of this and see what happens. It's actually kind of fortunate that it's just Twitter. Twitter is big, but it's only a tenth the size of Facebook. So even if he burns Twitter to the ground, it's not the end of the world. Oh, well, a new entrant will come in the marketplace and take over that niche, or multiple people will. To the first question, things that look like danger but aren't. I mean, I'm not quite sure I understood that. Could you?
Well, let me give an extreme example, then back off from it a little bit. The extreme example is something like an artist pixel by pixel generates an image of child pornography, right? It doesn't represent any actual crime that's occurred, but nonetheless, for almost everybody, they see it and they immediately go to an extraordinary danger that threatens children, right? So we have that kind of immediate connection with representational imagery. Likewise, some people will see race is being mentioned, or the reality of gender at a genetic level is being mentioned, and just mentioning the topic reminds them of so many kinds of dangerous phenomenon that have been implemented in human history, that as far as they are emotionally concerned, the indication of the topic is itself the source of danger. There's no actual danger in that moment, but it reminds them of danger, and they go into an endangered response. And that's an extremely common human reality. And so maybe most people are going to call for the censorship of things that are not dangerous, but remind them of danger because it provokes the same chemistry. And that's a huge force to push back against.
Yeah, this is what I'd call 21st century verbal safetyism. And my response to that is, fuck that. Don't be a fucking pussy. Suck it up and deal, right? Sorry. And so yes. I mean, reading serious books, for instance, is a profound and often scary endeavor, right? Read Plato's Republic. There's some amazingly intense things in there that will be quite disturbing if you actually understand them. So sorry, people, at least the hard-ass Rutt point of view is that if reading about X produces a disturbing reaction in yourself, try to avoid reading about X, but if it turns up periodically, oh well. If you want to forget that person, you want to block it, or again, as kind of tools we talked about, I don't ever want to hear the word integral. God damn it, it makes me want to reach for my pistol, as an example. But in terms of censoring ideas because it makes somebody feel uncomfortable, sorry, no. And I'm pretty sure Elon feels the same way. Great book called The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lubianoff. Takes a wonderful exploration of the recent growth in this idea of verbal safetyism and basically dismantles it for the pernicious idea that it is.
It does. That's a great book, and the fragilizing of the psyche that's going on in our contemporary society seems extremely dangerous. Probably more dangerous than the threat of rogue meme plexes taking people over and making them have the wrong opinions. There's something I wanted to touch on there. You mentioned books, and I was thinking about how I grew up in a world that was already permeated by digital networks, but one in which I still had a lot of old-fashioned trust in books and governments and progress and the other paraphernalia of modernity, including the idea of a generic public square, a mainstream consensus opinion space arrived at through complex discourse. But that might not be the direction in which digital technology inherently evolves us. We might be moving toward a world of competing and collaborating fluid reality networks in which a shared generic context of sense making just isn't an option anymore. So, what's your sense of information technology and where it's taking us? Are we already out of touch, even in thinking about things like a public square?
Well, we have a new public square, right? In say 1965, I would have been 11 years old. I was a pretty well-read 11-year-old. I'd already read things like Herman Kahn's On Thermonuclear War and Foundation trilogy and things of that sort. So I was thinking about these kinds of things when I was 11. We had a very restricted public square in the United States. We had 3 networks. And where I lived, Washington, D.C., there was one independent TV station. So we had 4 TV stations, basically. We had 2 daily newspapers, and we had a relatively small number of mass circulation magazines: Time Magazine, Newsweek, Life, and Look. I think were the 4 big ones at the time. So we had a public square. In 1965, the most popular TV show was The Beverly Hillbillies, which it's a silly ass TV show, but very well executed. At its peak, 65% of American households watched the Beverly Hillbillies on whatever, I think it was Thursday night. So we had a remarkably homogeneous public square. That ain't coming back, folks. That was a nature of the medium. These were times when the economics and the legal and regulatory regime tended towards monopoly newspapers, a handful of government-supported and very lightly regulated, but regulated broadcast platforms, et cetera. And that's a very different world. We're headed for a world that is many, many centered, as I call it, coherent pluralism, where the coherence will be relatively small and mostly around process, and the pluralism will be very broad, and people will define for themselves what the good life is. And that's good. I would say that that's actually a full refinement of the Enlightenment model, that we are to find our own definition of the good life and live it, and find the others to live it with. And the networks actually help us do that. So I remain hopeful that if we do it right, this transition from very few loud, ultra loud, and not very diverse, all old white men who control the editorships of all these magazines, all these newspapers, and where the news readers on these TV stations gets replaced by the world where everybody potentially has a voice, and any voice can be upregulated and any voice can be downregulated based on how it resonates with people.
Minimal set of protocols for coherent pluralism, establishing the foundation for a public square that's viable in the network age. I could get behind that.
Yeah, and very diverse and dynamic, right? Things that are gathering support, things that are losing support, new ideas, green shoots, most of which are bad, but every once in a while a good one comes up. Garage bands, most of which suck and have 70 listens on YouTube, but then somebody comes up with a whole new genre of music and suddenly 70 million people are watching it. That's the network world that I see and have loved ever since I discovered it in 1980, the potential for it. But it requires the right mindset to allow that to emerge. And lack of decorum is one of the things that that will cause it to degenerate into shit, as will, I believe, top-down point of view censorship by a small number of peculiar oligarchs and their employees.
You and I have discussed problems that you and GameBee and some of our kindred liminal web spirits have gone through in terms of sudden arbitrary exclusion from platforms. So maybe you could talk us through your example proposal of how an appeals process might work.
Yes, that's good. And as I've talked about before, the GameBee movement, all three admins of the Facebook GameBee group were simultaneously given a permanent, lifetime, and unappealable ban by Facebook. Fortunately, we had friends who could make a large noise, and we knew people in Facebook, and we got that reversed. But if it hadn't been for the fact we had connections, we would have been gone. That would have been a green shoot, gone forever, probably. Subsequently, we built our own online home in case that ever happens again. But it really does happen. And if you deal with these platforms, it's a combination of Orwell and Kafka. You get banned, and they'll say, you have been banned for violating our term of services. And oh, by the way, it's not appealable. Fuck you, right? And the terms of services in Facebook's case is page after page of interminable bad writing. And so you have no idea what you did, right? And so my proposal, I'm going to give the background on the statutory definition and then the appeals process. So my proposal is that any rule that's enforceable by any penalty must be codified in plain English in chunks of regulation no longer than 100 words. Second, any moderation action, such as banning a piece of content or giving a user a 3-day ban, must include connecting an actual piece of what somebody posted to one of these regulations. So, keep in mind when the police arrest you for spitting on the sidewalk, they don't arrest you for breaking the law, right? That would be very, very bad if the police started arresting you for breaking the law and refused to tell you what law you broke. Instead, they arrest you for spitting on the sidewalk, and then you can, go to court and prove whether you did or did not spit on the sidewalk. So there's at least a specific charge. The platforms need to get to that level. Now, realistically, at the scale of these platforms, some of this enforcement is going to need to be done algorithmically or by a combination of human signaling, reporting stuff, plus algorithms. And those algorithms today are far from perfect. And to expect perfection from them anytime soon is very naive. So there needs to be always a human appeal available. Whenever any automated moderation activity occurs, one should be allowed to appeal it to a human click, and there ought to be a term of service that says that these appeals will be adjudicated in 24 hours. Another one of our friends, Jordan Hall, got whacked by Facebook for 6 weeks as it dragged through the appeals process, right when he was in the middle of making some very important points. And those important points disappeared. And of course, conspiratorial people might think that he was whacked for that reason. I doubt it. I tend to rank incompetence well above malice in the behavior of most corporations, but sometimes there is malice. So to be fair, these appeals must happen rapidly, 24 hours. But an individual hourly employee paid by Facebook is inevitably going to make mistakes as well and may well be biased towards things that thinks the bosses want at Facebook. So I've also proposed a quite innovative second appeal that's available to anybody who's not satisfied with the first appeal. And this one is kind of fun. I think Elon would like it, which is you think you've been done wrong by the platform, you can post the sanction. Here's the content. Here's 12.3.1, 100 words or less, that you allegedly violated, and you have to put up a stake if you think you're been done wrong. In my example, minimum stake is $100. You put up the $100. It goes to a professional third-party arbitrator. The American Arbitration Association runs a network of many, many, many very professional arbitrators. I've actually used them in network adjudication around domain name squatting when I ran Network Solutions, and we had thousands of these adjudications per year, and they were quite good. I reviewed some of them, and we had third parties review them. We said, shit, they're getting it right 98, 99% of the time, which is pretty amazing. And so anyway, I think I've been done wrong by Twitter. I did not this text did not violate this 100-word regulation. Put up my $100. goes to the American Arbitration Association, selected a randomly third-party arbitrator who are professionally trained people to do this. And if they find for the platform, I lose my $100, keep frivolous claims. However, if I win, if I prevail, if the moderation action is reversed, the platform pays me 10x my stake. So I get $1,000 back for my 100. And oh, by the way, 100 is the minimum stake. You can stake up to $1 million, right? And so Facebook gets, or Twitter, let's use Twitter, keep on Twitter. Twitter gets it wrong. I put up $1 million stake. Twitter pays me $10 million. And if you think about it from a game theory perspective, that means that their moderation algorithms plus their first line of appeal must be right 90% of the time. If they're right more than 90% of the time, they will make money off this mechanism. If they are, if they're right less than 90% of the time, they're going to lose money. Now, here's the third part, and this is where it gets really fun. People say, well, shit, I'd like to put up $1 million to challenge Twitter about their moderation of my post, but I don't got $1 million. Very few people do. So I also propose a market in these claims. In the same way, there's kind of a gray market in personal claims injuries in civil court, at least in the United States. I'm proposing an explicit market in these claims. So here's my post. Here's the regulation I supposedly violated. I put it on the marketplace. And they say, I'm looking for backers for this claim. And the rule of the road would be anyone who wants to can stake actual money on the claim. And anyone who is a staker gets 80% of their stake if times 10 if they win. So they get 8x return if the claim is supported, i.e. the ban is overturned, and 20% goes to the initiator of the appeal. So suppose that you're dead broke, got no money at all. You ain't got two nickels to run together. You put up your claim. The marketplace looks at it, and once it reaches the threshold of $100, it goes into the arbitration process, and then but the backing can continue. And so, really egregious cases, even by somebody without any money at all, could get the full $1 million. Let's say the thing happens. You're right. Thing gets reversed. Facebook pays $10 million. You, the poor appellant, get $2 million as your 20% cut. The $8 million goes back to the backers who put up $1 million. So they get 8x on their bets. You get $2 million just being for the person that set this whole thing in motion. And oh, by the way, it sounds pretty violent and economically violent and threatening to Facebook or Twitter. But all it means is they got to be right 90% of the time. If they're right 90% of the time, they will make money off this marketplace. So isn't that interesting? So anyway, that's my systemic approach to how the moderation can be disciplined, and finally, in a very powerful way, by a series of escalating steps.
Yeah, there are some really nice features to that proposal. It gives them, the big platform, skin in the game in terms of trying to get it right more often. It allows, yes, there's a $100 bar to entry, so it's easier for people that have $100, but the market is a way around that. It's a fairly low bar to entry. It's much better than having no access to the system. The thing I guess I would be initially concerned about would be smaller platforms being bankrupted, people trying to game the system into false moves so that you can make the money off them, or something like distributed denial of service attacks, where you just keep them so busy fighting these challenges that they don't have anything. Like there's a famous case where Scientology launched hundreds of lawsuits against the Cult Awareness Network in Los Angeles. There were so many lawsuits, they just didn't have the time, energy, or money to even process them. And as a result, they had to hand over the Cult Awareness Network, which Scientology took over and continues to run, but they just moved Scientology from the cult category to the religion category.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Right? So how do we protect especially mid-sized platforms from overwhelming levels of attack in this manner?
very good. And I think that's an obvious fix to my proposal, which is that all these numbers have to be scaled to size. So I was thinking of the 10 million for Facebook size, and Twitter being a tenth of that. Perhaps for Twitter, the maximum stake could be 100,000 with $1 million payoff. $1 million isn't going to kill Elon Musk. Even $1,000 million mistakes isn't going to kill Twitter, but it gives them a hell of an incentive. And then for much smaller platforms, it would be scaled to their size based on monthly uniques. So if Twitter's at 200 million, a system that had 20 million, the stake limit might be 10,000. Again, but I think the answer is you're absolutely right. These scales have to be adjusted to the size of the platforms. And in terms of, distributed denial of service approach, I think the $100 is a pretty big barrier to doing that. You want to launch 1 million attacks, you got $100 million, sucker, right? And American Arbitration Association is pretty scalable. And to the degree that there's a marketplace for adjudicating these claims, getting paid $100. Oh, by the way, the key thing is the first $100 goes to the arbitrator. In both cases, no matter how it comes out, they get their $100. And you can build a massive industry of people who are adjudicating these things for $100. So I think that's actually a pretty decent barrier. If it turns out that's not high enough, maybe you have to raise it. But I do think what you raise is a very important point. And first reaction is scale all the numbers to the scale of the platform. And second is maybe you think about what the threshold is if it gets totally out of hand.
All right, that's plausible. Let's talk about anonymity. It's a difficult problem because on the one hand, we tend to instinctively assume people will be more authentic and better behaved if they're showing up as themselves, as we tend to do in historically evolved human communities. But on the other hand, the very nature of the digital realm inclines us toward identity play, masks and avatars, and beyond that, real concerns about doxing and the need for, say, dissidents to be protected from mobs and protected from governments. There's been some reporting that a big chunk of Twitter shares is controlled by members of the Saudi government who've been using special access to identify otherwise concealed citizens. So, Musk isn't the only danger. The existing board is already a danger. But if you were entering into Musk's position, how would you approach this question of how people are allowed to identify themselves in social networks?
Yeah, this goes back to experiences I've had over the last 40 years. One of my early experiences was as one of the two product managers for one of the earliest social media platforms called Participate. We call it social media today, even though it wasn't exactly that. And we actually ran two versions of it in parallel for a while. One that used your user ID, which was tied to your credit card and tied to your person, and the other, which was fully anonymous, where you could create multiple avatars at any time. Guess which one was the flaming dumpster fire, and the other one, which one was reasonably good? The anonymous one went to shit immediately, and we had to shut it down after a few weeks. While the one where the identities were tied to your persistent user identity and hence to your person was actually fairly decent. It was actually quite a very interesting experiment. In the very earliest days, became the number 5 product on The Source, which was the world's first consumer online service. We had hundreds of products, and number 5 was pretty good. So my initial knee jerk, and I'll admit it's a knee jerk, is real name ID. Your actual real name, resolvable to your picture, etc. And yes, there's some risk to being doxxed, etc. But there's, people can cyber stalk you and find out where you live, even if you're just walking down the street. Take your picture, do an image search on Google, find you, and then go from there. And the benefits for good discourse are so profound that at least on the public squares and at least in the democracies, I personally knee jerk towards full real name ID. Facebook has that in theory, though they don't enforce it well enough in practice. And I would go for that. But there is an intermediate case, which is persistent pseudo anonymity, where third-party services will work with, let's say, a Twitter, and they will issue exactly one username to exactly one actual human who has to prove that they're a human, to kind of bank know your customer levels. and you then can have masking, but in a moral sense, the username is accountable as the avatar of exactly one person. I think that is way better than what Twitter historically has been, which is anyone wants to spin up a username at any time, they can do so. They're not quite that loose anymore, but they were for a long time. And Reddit still is. Anyone wants to spin up a Reddit ID, I wish I knew how many Reddit IDs I have for various malicious purposes. But the pseudo-anonymity of locking one pseudonym to one human is an intermediate case, which probably makes sense on a platform like Twitter to allow people who have a legitimate reason not to put their own identity out. Though I would say that there ought to be a very easily visual icon which shows who is traveling under real identity and who is traveling under pseudo identity, so that we as consumers and users can curate that information differently. Frankly, my nature would be to rank more highly content that comes from real users than comes from pseudo-anonymous users.
There's I've got a half-formulated interest around something that came up for me listening to you on Rebel Wisdom. And I made this joke at the introduction about contaminating easily reprogrammable and passive human minds, because there is something, the classic liberal idea of the blank slate, the tabula rasa, this sense that a huge mass of people out there are just like pieces of hardware waiting for ideas to come along and drive them in a direction. So we have to put them in the right educational systems and get them moving in the right direction and make sure they don't get exposed to the bad ideas and the mind viruses, because they're just going to get reprogrammed by those and become a huge social problem. So it seems to be a lot of concern that people have around lessening viewpoint moderation is actually based in this visceral fear that that's what people are like. So the danger, not just of ideas, but of whole sets of ideas, of meme plexes running rampant through these easily reprogrammable human systems, seems to be on one side. And on the other side is this kind of old-fashioned idea that there's a God-given essence or a complexity instantiated set of processes in us that is somehow robust against things that we're merely hearing or merely saying, that there's something more in people than just what they're receiving through the media. So I'm curious, where you stand on that, because I think you probably don't lean too much toward there's a God-given individual essence, but I think you're not as concerned about people just getting randomly reprogrammed by potentially dangerous meme plexes as many other people are. So where are you in that spectrum?
Yeah, as usual, I would say my perspective is nuanced, right? And we talk about potentially dangerous meme plexes. My favorite example is religion, right? Lots of people have been programmed by potentially dangerous meme plexes. How many deaths have been caused by religion? How many indigenous societies were destroyed in the name of conversion, particularly to either Christianity or Islam? Those have been the two really vicious attackers of indigenous cultures over the years. So I'd say those meme plexes are out there, and they will stick, and they can do some harm. But at the end of the day, if we're going to take an enlightenment view that humans are responsible for what they create in terms of their culture, then I don't see the attempt for top-down suppression of even potentially harmful meme plexes as being appropriate to the condition of free people. And yes, some people will believe shit like QAnon, right? Some people believe astrology, right? Some people believe Donald Trump is actually the Tribune of the working man, right? People believe all kinds of ridiculous shit. On the other hand, over time, we believe, if we believe in democracy and we believe in the Enlightenment model of humanity, over time, there's a gradient towards the better and towards the good, and we make less mistakes over time. And that's my view, that it's neither black nor white, and nor do I believe that bad things will not happen due to a free speech point of view things. There will be some bad things that will happen. But on a net basis, the movement of society forward through the garage band perspective, is more important than the fact that some bad things will happen. And we're constantly making that trade-off. For instance, the trade-off I personally make with respect to gun control. If we allow citizens to own assault rifles, guess what? 75 people a year in the United States will be killed in mass shootings. I say, God damn it, it's a shame. I hate it. But it's a price worth paying to preserve our right to resist tyranny. And social systems design is about trade-offs. And as good old, what's his name, Nassim Taleb points out, being terrorized by small losses, avoiding small losses to expose oneself to big losses is the wrong way to think about the world. And humans seem to be particularly susceptible to that failure of thinking.
I love Nassim's critique. As a Canadian, I think I don't think those guns are protecting you from much tyranny down there. But what's actually coming up for me was a discussion I had with my dad in a mall years ago, and he was worried about digital surveillance. And I was too, but I was mitigating it by thinking about other forms of surveillance. And I said, everybody in this mall has a technology called eyeballs, and they can see exactly what you're doing all the time when you're in this mall. And also, the government used to publish everybody's address in the phone book. That's right. But we're not as worried about those things because they're a little older and we're a little bit more used to them. So when you bring up what I think is a very apt comparison between, say, QAnon being stupid and dangerous, but not necessarily more stupid and dangerous than bad Marxism, bad Christianity, bad Islam, it seems like you're being informed by a sense of longer spans of time than a lot of people who are in the superficial discourse on this topic. I think a lot of people who are asking themselves what we should do are acting as if there's no history, as if this year's Pontiac made last year's Pontiac obsolete, right? So when you argue about people in terms of how to approach these issues, do you have a sense that they are exaggerating recent phenomenon and not correlating it to historical phenomenon?
Of course, we know humans do that all the time, right? And I'll go back to gun control. Resisting tyranny is only necessary every couple of hundred years, but shoot 'em ups at shopping malls, happen a couple of times a year. And so if we have a bias towards the short term, we will be more willing to trade off eliminating the smaller short term harm versus preventing the longer term risk. And it's a very well known flaw in human cognition. It's often referred to as hyperbolic discounting, where we value the near term much more than we value the far term. And oh, by the way, that's what's making solving climate change so goddamn difficult. We don't value the lives of people 100 years from now the same way we value our ability to go out and put gasoline in our Range Rover this afternoon. And that's keeping us from being able to mobilize the resources we need to do to attack climate change, which the urgency which it needs to be attacked. So it's just one of many, many cases where this too highly discounting of the future comes into it. You're very perceptive to see that. And so again, that's the reason we have people who think longer term. In theory, that's why we have government and legislators and a Senate, people who are committed to a longer view. You Canadians are pretty wise. You appoint your senators for life. Maybe that's smart. I don't know. But who take a longer view. And if we don't take a longer view, we're going to be dead. If you're just a local hill climber, you're inevitably reach the top of the hill and step off a cliff.
Yeah. Something connected to that. There's a recency bias in thinking about Twitter moderation in terms of the discussions I've been hearing, right? There's this idea that Musk's administration might make bad decisions of all sorts, ignores the fact that the previous administration and the Twitter board has been making bad decisions for a long time now. Now, obviously, you're familiar with the pointless, stupid, and or malevolent suppression of the Unity 2020 campaign. My girlfriend was locked out of her Twitter account the day she started following that campaign. And that leads me to two things. First, tell Brett and Heather to come on this show, and I will convivially insult them in ways they never expected. But second, Do you think there's a problem or limitation in the very idea of a board of directors? Like, we seem to be pretending that having this board is some sacrosanct thing in terms of the way society is set up, and it's going to be disrupted either by anarchic networks or by autocratic individuals. Is the threat of anarchic networks and autocratic individuals greater than the threat of having a board of directors? How do we evaluate how dangerous that thing is? Because communism, capitalism, private, public, almost every social organization setup we have is run in roughly the same way. And, how big a danger might that be?
Oh, that's a very good question. Of course, it's systemic. It's not just about Twitter. It's about everything, right? Should General Motors be run by a board of directors elected by its shareholders, right? It's a very similar question. Of course, we're about to see a found experiment here. Go back to Aristotle. He lays out three basic kinds of governance: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. And of course, in Aristotle's time, democracy was a bad word, or sort of the equivalent of almost anarchy, but not quite. And so we're about to see Twitter go from oligarchy to monarchy. And Curtis Yarvin, who is kind of an interesting, if peculiar and somewhat scary individual, advocates for monarchy as the superior way to manage a nation state. I have very serious reservations about that. I hope to get him on my podcast again soon, talk about this. But we will see. And it may be that in the current environment, one strong-willed individual, Elon Musk, who probably won't have a board of directors, or if he does, it'll be a pure rubber stamp, may actually be able to do better than a pettifogging, compromising board of directors. But I think the other direction is also interesting to think about. And that would be a platform that's a cooperative owned by its users, right? And it might use something like liquid democracy, which I've written about, where you can proxy your vote to somebody who's more knowledgeable about governance issues than you are, who can then proxy it further. And the emergent result of these proxied cooperative votes are what would determine the policies. And under cooperative law, it's one person, one vote. So it's not who has the most money in it or anything else. And I think there's some very interesting explorations that need to be done there. And it's one of the good things that's coming out of the Web3 space, the crypto space, is work around DAOs and how DAOs should be governed. Now, a lot of DAOs, unfortunately, are governed by your stake, how much money you have, and then you're just will quickly degenerate into oligarchy, which may be worse than either monarchy or democracy. But I do think there needs to be explorations in this, and I'm particularly excited about some ideas around the decentralized web, which is a whole nother way of thinking about the world than Web3, to try to create user-owned cooperatives to do things like this. I think that would be very interesting. No guarantee it'll work, but I think we should do the experiment and see what happens.
Cooperative ownership puts me in mind of a scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There's this scene where King Arthur has a run-in with a peasant, and the peasant is arguing against dictatorships and proposes like an anarcho-syndicalist collective with rotating leadership until the king starts beating him. And the peasant, it's Michael Palin, he starts shouting, "Now we see the violence inherent in the system." I loved the lyricism of it when I was a kid. It seems like a lot of what we used to call the left was focused on forms of unfreedom that were built into the dominant corporate and government authority system. But now a lot of what we're calling the left seems to be focused on the danger of the unwashed conservative masses who ignorantly spread and succumb to the wrong viewpoints. That's a very different target, and one that seems to reinforce corporate and governmental authority. Has the left changed, or are we talking about something different when we say the left now? What's your take on how those definitions have shifted?
Yeah, that is very where it's funny you should mention this. I was actually engaged in a conversation about this morning, and I was making the point that somebody was critiquing me for posting my essay on Quillette, which I chose because it's sort of centrist and classically liberal in its perspective. They go, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I go, why didn't you put it in the Guardian or something? And I go, well, to my perspective, left and right have gotten themselves all twisted around with respect to free speech. In 1965, go back to that year again, why not? It was mostly the right that were the censors. There was still movie censorship in the United States at that time. You could not have communists on TV, at least certainly not on network TV. Certainly couldn't show a tit on TV, right? The attacks on that were from the left, and the defenders of the censorship were typically on the right. And then the most exemplary event was the Berkeley free speech movement at Berkeley University. Fairly radical left-wing people were advocating for radical free speech, that anything should be able to be said in the public square. In this case, literally a square, Sproul Square, Sproul Plaza. It was right in the middle of the Berkeley campus, very beautiful. And they wanted the right to pass out leaflets about anything. And they specifically said about anything, right? And that was the left perspective. And now people who call themselves the left, which I scratch my head about, some of these folks, are now lined up with the corporate oligarchs. What the hell, right? And seem to be in favor of more suppression of speech. And when you use the word free speech with people who call themselves left, these very new kinds of left, they actually knee-jerk and assume immediately you're a right-winger, which I am not, by the way. I'm impossible to categorize. I'm way out in hyperspace. It's neither left nor right. But when they hear free speech, they think right wing. What the fuck is that about, dudes? Don't you know your history? Don't you know about the American Civil Liberties Union? Don't you know about the Black Civil Rights Movement, where as well as fighting for, repealing Jim Crow laws and explicit racism, people were also fighting for the right to say this, right? And they literally get arrested for saying that a black person should sit in at a white lunch counter that was whites only. You could be arrested for saying that in the South in 1955. So free speech was part of the civil rights movement. And how these new-called pseudo-lefties have gone in this direction, I got my head scratching my head, except that I am cynical enough to believe that people will wield power against their enemies whenever they have it. And as it turned out, in the 60s, conservative status quo people, even if not politically conservative, culturally conservative people, had most of the power. They owned the networks, they owned the magazines, they owned the TV shows and the newspapers. And so they censored who they thought of as the upstarts. Now, the power in these platforms seems to have been captured by a left perspective, and this kind of new left, this identitarian left, which I don't consider to be the traditional left at all. And they have the power, so they're going to use it to beat up on their enemies. I think it's as simple as that.
It reminded me of a section that I read this book often. I grew up in a really small town. We had to take the ferry to the next biggest town that had a library in it. And so I would always get out this book, Aha, by Martin Gardner. It was a compendium of mathematical paradoxes. And it had one section where there were these cartoons. And one of the cartoons was someone shouting, "People who shout all power to the people want all the power to go to the people who shout all power to the people." And as soon as they have the power, of course, they're going to use it.
Exactly. So if you just use that lens, it explains a lot that seems otherwise inexplicable. People that have a stick will hit their enemies with it. That's just the way it goes. And currently the left thinks it has this new left, this weird left, not really the left in my mind, has the power, and they're going to use it as a stick to hit the people they think are their opponents. Human nature. Oh, well.
So we need a mindset and ethos that can make the emerging technological environments more useful and more palatable for human well-being and civilization development. And one of the aspects of that is what you're proposing here, right? We have to come up with protocols that are reasonably minimal, but which support the kind of spaces we want. But another side of it is not the protocols, but the individual development. Like the skills that are needed in each of us to be able to say, not freak out so much when we hear a contradictory viewpoint that we can't allow it to exist. So what's your sense of the life practices that people need in order to be the kind of people who can play a role in the kind of world you would ideally envision?
Yeah, very important point, because any change in our institutional structures has to co-evolve with the people who are making up those structures. Key insight we had in the Game B movement, that you can't speak of either independently, right? If you don't have the right people, you can't have institutions of type X. And oh, by the way, most people need to be supported by the institutions around them. And only maybe 2% of people can be, cantankerous motherfuckers who do what they want, irrespective of their social context. So the social context has to be supportive of these new kinds of people. So the two kind of have to spiral up. And I think there's a whole lot in the area of psychotechnologies, which can help people increase their mental robustness and resilience. I think meditation is very useful. I think being out in nature is very useful. I think Jamie Wheel talks a fair bit about ceremony. I think going to deep depths in oneself is very helpful, whether it's through psychedelics or engaging in dangerous sports. I think Tyson Yunkaporta, very eloquent on manhood and womanhood rituals that can be powerful, disturbing, individual changing. All these things need to be thought about. How we raise our anti-safetyism. I'll start with that one. This new ethos of everything has to be safe. If people knew how us kids in the 50s and early 60s were raised, they'd shit down both legs probably, right? And so all these things need to be brought back or brought in for the first time. One of my more crazed proposals is that part of high school ought to be 2 acid trips. First, a 75 microgram, let's get you acquainted with the concept, light trip with, right set and setting and with plenty of preparation. And then your graduation ceremony, 200 micrograms, kind of light ego death trip to really set yourself free. I think that if people went through that, seeing something that might be disturbing or offensive on Twitter would probably not bother them nearly as much. So let's build more resilient, deeper, stronger, anti-fragile humans at the same time we're opening up the public square.
LSD in schools. Fantastic.
Listen, if I wasn't uncancelable, somebody would try to cancel me over that.
We're coming pretty close to the end of this. This is our last chance. If there's anything else you would like to bring up in this, or whether you just want to praise me, you've got a chance for a final thought before I wrap this up.
All right. One last thought, which was not in my essay, and I have not even talked much about on the various podcasts, is what we've talked about so far is nowhere near enough. This is just a starting ante. To really make these platforms work for collective sense making, we need somehow, and I don't have any answers yet, gradient towards the better. And an interesting analog is Wikipedia, right? One could easily imagine Wikipedia descending into shit, everybody on Earth having the theoretical ability to edit any Wikipedia article they want. But the norm of NPOV, as they call it, which is no point of view, which is a social norm only, it's not enforced by anybody, results in the cloud of editors editing each other in such a way that the emergent result is amazingly good. Is it perfect? No, but it's amazingly better than I ever would have thought it would have been. We need to add those kinds, analogous, not the same, but an analog into our public square, because merely being free is not enough. It's better than being suppressed, but there needs to be gradients towards the 3 big ones: the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I don't have the answers to those, but I'm going to be thinking about it. And I would encourage other people to think about, what do we do beyond the minimum of freedom and make these systems that work for all of humanity, ratcheting us up to a better place rather than ratcheting us down to a worse place. And that work has not yet even been contemplated, I don't believe, but it may be some of the most important work for the next decade.
I love the degree to which you're trying to participate in this, right? There's a virtue orientation, there's a speaking out of experience and having seen a lot of experiments in different kinds of moderation play out. There's a call for complexity. There's an attempt to get beyond the simplistic, superficial moderation or no moderation discussion. And I think the attempt to envision ways that Musk could fulfill his promise is a much smarter thing to do than wondering whether he will or will not fulfill his promise. So I love that you're participating here. It's very fun to talk with you as always, Jim. Thank you very much.
Yeah, as always, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thanks for having me on.